With all that war erupting between Russia and Ukraine, the world is watching on tonight with fear it could develop into a wider conflict, as we were discussing then. To understand what's going on, let's take a look at what's led to the crisis.
Ukraine was part of the former Soviet Union, a Cold War foe of the West. In 1991, as the communist state was collapsing, Ukraine declared its independence. As a young KGB intelligence officer, now Russian President Vladimir Putin watched on as his beloved Union fell apart. Since then, he's been on a mission to return Russia to what he believes is its rightful place on the world stage, while staying fixated on its relationship with Ukraine. He's previously stated, "I'm confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia, for we are one people." Fast forward to 2014, the revolution is in the air in Ukraine. Violent protests eventually lead to the ousting of pro-Russian leader Viktor Yanukovych. Putin's response? He illegally annexes the Ukrainian region of Crimea, sparking a new war between Western-backed Ukraine and its old motherland. Tragically, many Australians were caught up in the chaos when Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down by a missile in July later that year. 28 Australians were among the 298 people who lost their lives. Our government held Russia responsible. The area the plane came down was in eastern Ukraine, where fighting had broken out between pro-Russian separatists and the country's new government. The region is now at the centre of today's tensions. The People's Republic of Donetsk and People's Republic of Luhansk, two rebel states born out of the hostilities. It became the front line of the war against the Ukrainians along roughly 420 kilometres of border. A rattled Ukrainian government started leaning more on its historic enemy, the West, even making plans to join the military alliance NATO. The member states of NATO, which include much of Europe and the United States, agreed to help defend any country in the treaty that comes under attack. The Kremlin's view of this possibility, a threat to Russia, and the alliance proposal wedged Ukraine in a wider geopolitical battle with Western nations. Putin ramped up his hostile approach, sending more support to the rebel states in Ukraine before ultimately declaring war on a former Soviet brother. His militant vision to reunite one people being realised with devastating force.
Let's go to London now, where I'm joined by Professor Michael Clarke, a security analyst and former Director General of the international think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. Professor, good to have your time tonight. Thank you.
OK.
Now, Putin's pulled the trigger on a full-scale war with Ukraine. What do you think is his strategy in the initial days of this invasion?
He'll want this invasion to go as quickly and successfully as possible. So he's obviously going for broke. We did wonder whether he would, as it were, try to frighten everyone with forces all the way around the fringes of Ukraine so that what happened in the Donbass was somehow more acceptable. But he's obviously going for broke. So it looks as if the obvious strategy will be to take Kharkiv in the east, to take Odessa in the south. And one of my friends from Odessa told me that there was shelling in the port. And then, of course, probably to surround Kiev. So with those three cities, those are the first, second and third cities in Ukraine, if those can be bottled up, then he can remove the government and then install a puppet government, and then he'll assess his options from there. That would be my guess.
So we have the international community talking about sanctions, but not actually boots on the ground as such. Does Ukraine itself, does its defence system stand any chance against these Russian forces, particularly in those three key centres that you just mentioned?
Not ultimately. With the forces that the Russians have got are in the area, they more or less outnumber the Ukrainians about 2-to-1 in most respects on ground forces, in the air and completely at sea. I mean, the Ukrainians have got no navy to speak of, and the Russians have got these at least 6 assault ships in the Black Sea. 3 of them only came through the Bosphorus a few days ago. So they will be successful. The Russians will be militarily successful, at least in the short term. The question is whether the Ukrainians are able to fight in the way that they say they will, and they are much better organised than they were in 2014. They do have quite good equipment, and they do have some very good units. But the good elite units can't be everywhere. They can only be in some places. And most of the best of the Ukrainian army units are down in the southeast around the Donbass area. So the best the Ukrainians could hope for is to give the Russians enough of a bloody nose to actually make Putin think twice about the sort of strategy that he is pursuing. But the fact is that they are on their own. Everyone else will sympathize deeply, will stand aside, and will be outraged by what is happening. But there's only a limited amount the rest of the world is going to be able to do.
For want of a better term, Professor, is this good old-fashioned ground warfare that we're seeing here that Russia's deploying?
Yeah, it's a very 19th century approach. It's often said, a lot of people said this, that Putin has got a 19th century mentality to 21st century problems. He always thinks in territorial terms. And the questions that we have is, to what extent will it be a week of fighting? Will it be 2 or 3 weeks of fighting? And will there be a constant, then, effectively a civil war, guerrilla war that will arise from that? But of course, the Ukrainians are going to have to be extraordinarily brave, because they're fighting in what will, at least in the short term, be a losing cause, and they're fighting for the opinion and the view of the rest of the world.
I mean, Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has said that his aim here is to demilitarize Ukraine, essentially to neutralise any of its lethal weaponry. But that would seem to be a very strange way of describing what he's doing now. He wants control of that country and to make it part of the Russian Federation again.
That's correct. I mean, he says he wants to demilitarize it as if Ukraine was somehow a military threat to him, and to denazify it as if, which is part of his rhetoric, that it's actually controlled by neo-Nazis who are all in the pocket of the West. Insofar as he has any sort of point, his argument is that the West has actually put arms into Ukraine, has helped Ukraine, although all the weapons that have gone into Ukraine are effectively weapons that they can only really use in their defense. And I suppose what a lot of Russians say is, look, Ukraine is not in NATO, but by God, NATO is in Ukraine. And we want to set down a new red line which keeps NATO out of this area of influence.
Well, we will watch and see. It'd be good to talk to you again because you have very good insight on all of this. Professor Michael Clarke, thanks for joining me tonight.